Folks, hi, good afternoon. My name is Simon Nicholson. I teach at American University here in town, and I co-direct a group called the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy. Thanks for the invitation to be with you today. The panel session that we've set up is designed as a roundtable. We're going to give a series of connected remarks on the subject of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as a response to climate change. So again, Simon Nicholson. I'm joined by David Morrow, who's with me at American University with the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy. Breitburg-Smith, who's with a group called Resolve here in town, which is an environmental think tank and facilitation group. And Olufemi Taiwo is an assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University. So I'm going to give you just a bit of background on what carbon removal is, just for a few minutes. I'll then turn to David, who's going to give us a sense of how to take a pretty abstract conversation and make it more concrete in terms of how we work out what's good and bad in terms of different forms of carbon removal response options. Maya's going to give us some of the flavor of domestic civil society, non-governmental organization consideration of carbon removal options. And then Femi is going to take us into the kind of international context a little bit and how we can avoid the pitfalls of what Femi calls climate colonialism when it comes to consideration of carbon removal. So, to set the stage for you, climate change is a thing, and there are lots of ways to represent what climate change is as a thing. I'm going to show you two of my favorite figures, and favorite meaning most desperately awful. So the world's getting warmer, and the world is getting warmer rapidly. What this chart shows is the spiraling out of temperature from a pre-industrial temperature average, getting close to the 1.5 degree target, which was agreed to with the Paris Agreement. So the world is saying, world leaders, we should aim for no more than 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial averages. That's what that whole Paris Agreement is about. We're already approaching that threshold. 5 degrees colder than pre-industrial averages was the last ice age. We, the world, humanity, is currently on track for 6 to 8 degrees of warming, depending on who you listen to by the end of the century, which is a science fiction world. And so what the scientists are telling us is we need to get our act together. The traditional, let me show you one more figure, which kind of makes this point in a different way. The first graph spiraled outwards. This one's spiraling inwards to show the collapse of the Arctic. Arctic sea ice is disappearing. The amount of warming that's already happened on the planet is having dramatic impacts on geophysical systems, features of the Earth, and in turn is having massive repercussions for living beings, including human beings. So again, the scientists say we need to get our act together. The traditional way that in the climate policy conversation the world has tried to get its act together is in two ways, with what's called mitigation or emissions abatement, basically stop putting climate pollution into the atmosphere. So change energy systems, food systems, transportation, to stop putting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's the first and most important step. Secondly, adaptation. That is, how do you adapt to change already baked into the climate system? Now, over the last handful of years in particular, it's become clear that mitigation and adaptation, although they're essential, may not be enough to avoid large-scale climate impacts. And so some new things are on the table in the climate policy response conversation. We're here to talk about one set of new response options that are being talked about with more and more frequency. These are so-called carbon removal options. So options that would take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere where it's trapping radiation and warming the planet, and take that carbon dioxide, turn it into products, or put it underground or into other forms of long-term storage. The Paris Agreement already has provisions allowing for consideration of carbon removal. This week in Madrid is the annual climate change meeting. There's some conversation taking place there about how countries can start to, in their pledges to take action, consider the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement talks about a balancing of emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases by mid-century and into the second half of the century. You know about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Does that ring bells, right? So the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific body which kind of gives authoritative statements at the international level of what we know about climate science, put out a special report on that 1.5 degree target a year or so ago. And out of that 1.5 report, we got a pretty strong message from scientists that meeting that 1.5 degree threshold or staying beneath it is going to be almost impossible absent large-scale carbon dioxide removal. This was the punchline here. All of the pathways that were considered in that report that stay beneath 1.5 project the use of carbon dioxide removal on gigantic scales over the course of the century. So just to concretize what I'm talking about, let me give you some of the options that folks are looking at. Removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in some ways is a straightforward proposition because we have biological machines that do it already. Plant trees, they take in carbon dioxide. Look after soils and augment those soils in various ways. The soils can hold carbon dioxide and potentially take down more carbon dioxide. Those sorts of options are biological pathways. Some call them natural solutions or nature-based responses to climate change. The problem is that the scales that are being talked about, that carbon dioxide removal may be necessary, it doesn't appear that this side of this figure is going to be enough. And so there's more conversation now about what's on the other side of this chart here, the more speculative or technological side of the carbon removal equation. Over here we have things like what's known as direct air capture. So these would be artificial systems, technological or mechanized systems using chemical membranes that would pull carbon dioxide from the open atmosphere and then using a variety of methods, take that carbon dioxide, turn it into a supercritical liquid, put it underground into long-term storage. That's the direct air capture promise. Accelerated weathering is a notion that the long-term carbon cycle can be sped up. In the long term, carbon dioxide would find its way from the atmosphere, I'm talking tens of thousands of years, back into rock formations. Accelerated weathering is the idea that that process might be sped up. Can you speed up this weathering? And there are ways potentially to do that. On this side of the chart, we have things that show enormous promise in terms of their technical capacity to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but there are a whole set of challenges associated with those approaches that maybe we can anticipate David will get into a little bit. In the middle here, we have something known as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is a system that would operate by, in a number of steps, growing biomass, switchgrass, corn, whatever it is, take that biomass and turn it into a liquid fuel or burn it directly, and then capture the carbon dioxide emitted from that combustion and put it into storage. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or sequestration. Each of the steps can be done. There are small-scale pilot projects which do this. The sorts of scales that are being talked about, though, for all of these things combined as a piece of climate response means that trying to do everything by one method alone is potentially a very bad idea. So I'm going to finish and turn to David by reminding you of the scale of what we're talking about here. The scientists and the models that they depend on to tell us about future climatic change are suggesting that between 100 and 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide needs to be taken out of the atmosphere over the course of the century. That translates into something like 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere per year by century's end, maybe a lot more. To put that into context, because these numbers are meaningless, right? Because how can we even start to understand what that means? All of human activity at the moment puts about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, about 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent if you take account of other greenhouse gases. 50 gigatons today, 10 gigatons per year of that 50 gigatons of today being pulled back out of the atmosphere and put underground by century's end. It's an enormous, almost monstrous proposition that we need to contemplate. So is that enough of a setup?
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
David.
Should we stand? Do you guys want to sit? Do we want to stand?
Meaning you'd like to ask questions about them, or?
No, can we access them?
Oh, totally. I'm happy to share them. I'll find out from the organizers if there's a method to share the slides. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks, Simon. Simon's given us one way of thinking about why we are here talking about carbon removal. I want to take a slightly different approach to roughly the same question. In some sense, we are here in this room talking about carbon removal because almost 20 years ago, a Swedish grad student started thinking about how to make the Swedish paper industry more profitable. And it occurred to him that if you captured the carbon dioxide that's created when you are running a paper pulp mill, carbon markets ought to reward you handsomely for this. Because the way this works, you take a tree, you strip off the bark. You can't make paper pulp from the bark, so instead you burn the bark to make steam to run the mill. And if you capture that carbon and you put it underground, not only have you prevented these emissions from the paper mill, but you have actually reduced the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere because the trees have absorbed it from the air as they grew, and then the industrial process catches it and buries it. So this is an example of what's come to be called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, which Simon mentioned. So how do we get from there to here? Well, when this grad student presented his research on this in 2001, there was a guy in the audience named Michael Obersteiner who works on integrated assessment models, IAMs. These are software models that combine a model of the climate with models of the economy and the energy system and land use to help us understand the long-term impacts of climate policy. And Obersteiner realized that he could take this idea and he could really easily put it into his model, not just for our industry, but for the whole energy system. And at that scale, it can actually remove a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you fast forward about a decade to when the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is writing up their 5th assessment report, right? Their periodic assessment of what the world knows about climate change and how to respond to it. And they're surveying the published scientific literature, looking for modeled pathways to keep the world under 2 degrees, and it turns out there were quite a few of them in the literature, 116. And that 87% of those involved large-scale carbon removal, almost all of which was done through BECCS, because BECCS was the one that was easy to put in the models. All the modeled pathways to keeping below 2 degrees involved large-scale carbon removal, and almost all of that carbon removal was done with BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So people read this report when it was published, this part in 2014, and they drew 2 lessons that are relevant for us today. Lesson number 1, it's going to be really, really hard to stay below 2 degrees, much less the 1.5 degree target, the ambition set at Paris, without large-scale carbon removal. So that's lesson number 1. It's really hard to meet these goals without carbon removal. Lesson number 2, if you do carbon removal wrong, very bad things can happen. So let's talk about that in terms of BECCS in particular, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Because these models simulated virtually all of their carbon removal in terms of BECCS, they envisioned that society would be planting bioenergy crops like switchgrass on an area of land equivalent to 1 to 2 times the size of India. It's a lot of land. And in a future where we also have some 10 billion mouths to feed, that's likely to mean a dramatic expansion of agricultural land, which is going to be bad for biodiversity. It's going to be bad for water security. This is likely to mean economic competition for arable land between food and fuel, which is going to drive up food prices, which is going to be bad for food security. And if the last sort of round of biofuel versus food fights are any indication, you're also going to get social and political conflict over land, where the world's poorest and most vulnerable people are going to get the short end of the stick. Right? Very bad things if you do it wrong. So some people look at those very bad things, at those risks, and they say, well, carbon removal just needs to be off the table. Right? This is a bad thing. It cannot be allowed onto the climate policy agenda. And so in terms of those two lessons, right, it's hard to reach these goals without carbon removal, but if you do it wrong, bad things happen. They prioritize lesson number 2 and say, well, we've got to find some other way to do it. Other people, by contrast, look at these two lessons and they say, well, yeah, carbon removal might be bad, but climate change is really bad. So if we need this stuff, let's do it. And they just sort of gently set to one side all these bad things that could happen. So our view at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy is that we can and should take both of these lessons seriously. That we are almost certainly going to need carbon removal to meet the goals set out in Paris. So let's do it. But if it's not done in the right way, very bad things can happen. So let's do it right. So what does that mean? Well, the concept that we use to think about this is the concept of sustainable carbon removal. And the notion of sustainability we have in mind here is it's a common one. It rests on 3 pillars, an environmental pillar, a social pillar, and an economic pillar. So to be sustainable, in our sense, carbon removal has got to be environmentally sound, it's got to be socially just, and it has to be economically viable. What does that look like in practice? Well, for one thing, it means that you don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? So you're not going to do all of your carbon removal through bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or any other single technology, because the problems start to appear when you are doing these at too large a scale or where you're doing them in the wrong context. So instead, what we need is a well-balanced portfolio of different approaches to carbon removal, suited to local conditions, all wrapped in policies that can protect the environment, safeguard people's rights, and distribute the burdens and benefits of carbon removal as safely as possible. This raises 2 questions that occupy a lot of the work that we're doing. One is, how do you think about measuring that, right? What is the metric for protecting the environment or safeguarding people's rights? The short answer there is we think there's a lot of progress to be made in thinking about connections between carbon removal and the metrics that have been chosen to measure progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Right? These are very specific indicators arrived at through this lengthy international negotiation process that say these are some of the things we care about in thinking about sustainable development, both for people and the planet. The second question that interests us is how do you make sure we're making progress on those indicators? It turns out that we already have a lot of the sorts of policies and instruments that you might need, just standard environmental protection issues, social impact analyses, risk analyses, economic impact analyses, and so on. There are holes that need to be patched. There's work to be done to apply one thing to another. But a lot of the tools are things that we already have. And so that is why we're here at a science policy event talking about carbon removal, because I think we are going to need it. And so we need to get serious now, thinking about how to craft good policy to make sure that it's done well. Thanks.
Thanks, David.
Try to use this handheld. Sounds like it's working. So I want to talk a little bit about where the U.S. environmental NGO community is, from my perspective, some of the things I've heard folks are thinking about around carbon dioxide removal. I have worked with a number of groups, not all of them, so I'll kind of share some of the highlights that I've heard, but it's a very nuanced and complicated conversation, so I won't get into all of the issues. And maybe I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about some areas that I think there could be value in in focusing on looking forward. I kind of want to highlight a couple of those topics and then talk a little bit about a meeting that I was involved in back in 2018. I worked on with Simon and David, and where I think the conversation is today, and you'll see why I think these are some areas that would be important to focus on. So first, I think information sharing on this topic is really important. It's complicated. There's a lot of different pieces of it, and while I think a lot of the big environmental NGOs have a lot of that background, there's a lot of others who are involved in the conversations about climate change and climate policy who don't have that understanding. And so more information sharing about why carbon dioxide removal, CDR, might be important to improve that learning and give space for folks to explore what their positions might be. I think also reflecting on disputes that have happened in the past in the environmental community around mitigation and adaptation, and how disagreements around pursuing action in those two areas many years ago impacted I think in some ways, in many ways, the success of climate action is a lesson around, for folks working on the issue today, around looking for ways to have a shared narrative, a shared framework to kind of avoid those public disputes, so to help the environmental community move forward together with a shared framework to make sure that doesn't impact climate advocacy. And then also we talked a bit about the technology. There's different levels of comfort with some of the technological approaches to CDR, and I think there might be some space for dialogues around conditions or safeguards that the environmental community might support to help that technology be developed in a way that they're comfortable with. So those are just a couple of ideas, and just to talk about where they come from, I wanted to talk about this meeting that we worked together on in 2018. It was environmental NGOs. It was sponsored by the Johnson Foundation, the Rasmussen Foundation, New York Community Trust, and with the Institute. And it was mostly US-based environmental NGOs. All the folks in the room worked on climate policy and some on environmental justice as well. The meeting was timely. It happened just before the IPCC report showing the impacts of warming on, what the impacts of warming to 1.5 degrees would be, and that emphasized the role that carbon dioxide removal might need to play. We did pre-interviews before the meeting that I think really echo a lot of the same kind of concerns that you might hear around CDR today. So a lot of concern around the moral hazard, or how the focus on carbon dioxide removal might take pressure off of mitigation efforts, so efforts to reduce emissions. Concern around just varying levels of comfort around natural versus technological, or biological versus technological approaches. And at that time, and we also heard quite a bit about concerns around the social and economic impacts. And at that time, it was more of so back September 2018, it was more of a fringe topic. A lot of organizations were just starting to talk about it, but maybe didn't have their position on it at the time. And so the meeting was structured to create a space for learning, for dialogue, for folks to think about how they might be thinking about how they might want to work on or think about carbon dioxide removal in their organizations looking forward. Some of the takeaways from that meeting were, I think we continue to see different levels of comfort with the natural and technological approaches. So many, as we heard, many people have been working on and thinking about biological approaches for a long time. And there were a lot of concerns about the link between technology development and the fossil fuel industry, how some of the technologies might help the fossil fuel industry or continue the use of fossil fuels. There was quite a bit of agreement on the need for research and development. I will say, stepping back just a moment, there were no agreements at the meeting. We didn't ask people to kind of come to consensus on anything. It was just these were some of the takeaways from the meeting. But So research and development would be really important on carbon dioxide removal, but there might need to be some preconditions on that. And I think most of the people we felt seem to leave kind of with that understanding of how important, of the important role for CDR looking forward. And since that meeting, kind of after that meeting, the IPCC report on 1.5 came out. A number of other studies have come out that show how urgent action is needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and the role that carbon dioxide removal would play in that. And so I think since that time, interest and attention to the issue has really rapidly increased from NGOs and funders as well. I also think that the concerns we heard at the meeting about the technology development have not gone away. In fact, I think they've kind of amplified a bit from my experience, from what I've heard from folks, especially the direct air capture technology relies on carbon capture and storage. There are some connections between the oil industry and developing that technology and how and the incentives, financial incentives they have to do that. And there's just a long history of distrust between that industry and the environmental NGOs, and so there continue to be those concerns about that technology and what it might mean to develop it. And I think related, but somewhat different, is this continued divide around natural and technological approaches, and there have been there are groups who are kind of pointing to other pathways that might not require that technological approaches, and I think there are different assumptions in each of these pathways that many people have concerns about. So I just, there's that divide, and that continues. And so kind of coming back to what I mentioned at the beginning, I think that information sharing, making sure people have the understand what the science is showing, getting groups together to look at ways that they can work on what they care about without kind of creating divides in climate action and their advocacy for climate action, and thinking about whether there are some ways that the technology can be developed in a way that doesn't that environmental NGOs can be comfortable with. So maybe those conditions or safeguards. So that's just a little bit of where I see the environmental community is today, and a couple of takeaways.
Much appreciated, Maya. Thank you. And Femi.
Let me see if does this mic work? Yeah. All right, thank you. So I'm a political philosopher. I think about this issue from the standpoint of justice. And climate change, climate emergency, whatever euphemism we like, in a way represents sort of the largest distributive justice problem in human history. There are a lot of different views of distributive justice, and I think if you Google distributive justice, you're going to find things that perhaps haven't yet caught up to the kinds of issues that come up in with respect to climate. But I think a sort of intuitive way that distributive justice tends to be thought about is a simple idea like this. Allocation of benefits and burdens from the result of intentional activity, so a policy or a set of policies, stuff that we do in the world. How we allocate, how we divvy up the benefits and burdens of that should be sensitive to responsibility. How sensitive? We can get into the weeds there, but there should be some relationship. Here's the relationship of responsibility for climate change to the distribution of its impacts. The global south, cumulatively speaking, especially if we're counting per capita, far and away the least contributors to the problem of climate change.
Sorry, who's the least contributors?
The global south. So Africa, Indian subcontinent, small island nations. Certainly in an absolute sense, and especially in a per capita sense, the least contributors to global emissions cumulatively from the Industrial Revolution to present. And the places I just mentioned are also the places likely to be affected first and worst by climate impacts. So I think on pretty much any acceptable view of distributive justice, something's gone wrong there. Something's gone quite basically wrong. The people who have caused the problem the least will be affected the most and will be affected first. So how this plays into carbon removal is that it complicates the politics from a perspective of justice, of which carbon removal technologies that we should roll out and how rolling those out is going to affect distributive justice, globally speaking, on the issue of climate change. I think the clearest explanation, the clearest aspect of carbon removal that presents a problem is in land use politics. So David was mentioning a bit of this earlier, but take BECCS, for example, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And that could be anywhere from 1 to 2, that could require land mass to be dedicated to the project of BECCS at the scale of 1 to 2 times the size of India. Right? So first of all, from a global perspective, that's a problem. But from a perspective of distributive justice, keeping in mind the things I was saying earlier, that problem takes on a different kind of political dimension. And the question is, where are we going to get this land, speaking from a global perspective? The answer of financial markets has been fairly unequivocal. So after the financial crisis in 2008, there was a massive transnational rush of capital to buy up land. Part of it was a response to commodity prices. Part of it's likely a response to guesses about long-term food and energy security. But the end result was a lot of land in the global south was taken up. No one was harder hit than the African continent. By some estimates, 25% of all arable land has been acquired through large-scale land acquisitions in the present tense. That represents a land area roughly the size of Zimbabwe. It's a quarter of the arable land on the planet. For example, a country like Liberia, more than 50% of its square miles owned in this fashion. Yeah, so sovereign wealth funds from abroad, multinational corporations, states, all players in this game of land acquisition. And what this is going to mean, politically speaking, going forward, I think it's going to take on a pretty pessimistic outlook as the effects of climate change accelerate, and especially as they accelerate for rich countries, the global north, and G20 nations. These things will be used to shore up food and energy security for other places other than, say, Liberians or Zimbabweans, right? So put that way, that's a pretty dire case. And so you might be surprised that nevertheless, I think one of the stronger cases for carbon removal is one that is looking the global south situation, especially the African situation, fairly square in the face. I think there's a pro-African case for carbon removal, and it goes something like this. First of all, a moral precept, right? You spilt it, you clean it, right? So if we don't think about carbon removal as an on and off switch, and if we instead think, the scientists have said, carbon removal has to be employed at a global level. We have to remove hundreds of gigatons of carbon. It instead becomes a distributive problem. So the way we should think about it is, which countries should take responsibility for dealing with the land use politics of carbon removal? Which countries should take responsibility for the initial research and development problem? And so the effect of this moral precept that I'm offering is to say, globally speaking, there should be carbon removal, and the way that we need to think about rolling that out is distributing the upfront costs of investing in carbon removal towards the countries that are higher per capita emitters, that are comparatively well off in the global distribution of wealth. There's also a technical case for it. There are technical answers to the sorts of political problems that get attached to carbon removal. So one of the big issues with carbon removal that I've been talking about is land use politics, right? And the current pessimistic guess, if we don't get out in front of this, is rich countries, rich corporations are going to gobble up land in the global south. They're going to displace indigenous populations, and they're going to do with it what they will. Sometimes that will be carbon removal. Sometimes it will be growing agricultural commodities, so on and so forth. That's the way that things are going to go. But that's not, from a scientific perspective, at all the way that things have to go. There are technical ways that we could roll out carbon removal that are better. For example, take another technology like direct air capture. Right? So we could build a factory that's going to just pull carbon dioxide out of the air and store it underground, perhaps in an aquifer, perhaps in other forms of geological storage. By the current scientific evidence, it's not of it's not of significant atmospheric relevance where we put such facilities. And those facilities don't take up a lot of space. So presumably, we wouldn't have to displace indigenous peoples in the global south in order to build these facilities. We could build these facilities anywhere we have a few acres of spare land. That could be in the global north, so on and so forth. So there are technical solutions to the problem of global north-south justice. And the last thing that I want to say about this case is to point out that at least in the two reasons that I gave you just now for carbon removal and for a particular way of thinking about rolling out carbon removal, the distinction between technological solutions and nature-based solutions didn't play much of a role. So if we think of a nature-based solution, like say afforestation and reforestation, right? Making sure we're planting more trees. That could be worse from a political perspective than direct air capture because it uses more land, there's more restrictions on land use, and if the land use that we're thinking of is in the global south, then that could trigger the kinds of disruptive politics of global north-south justice that I'm thinking about. So there's no, from the perspective of climate justice, post-colonial climate justice, if you will, there's not an obvious reason why technological solutions are necessarily better than nature-based solutions or the other way around, right? There are just a set of concerns to think about and a set of distributive justice problems that we need to solve. Thanks.
Femi, thank you. So I invited my colleagues to keep their remarks quite brief so that we'd have plenty of time for conversation given the setting. It feels like this is a good place to talk to each other. And so let me invite questions, comments. Let me click 2 or 3 questions, then we'll turn to the panel and come back. Please.
Have there been studies on what happens to the land or the inside of the earth with all of this carbon liquefying and storing carbon dioxide?
Thanks. So question, if one of you can keep that question in mind. We have 2 more hands here, so let's take just a couple of additional questions.
Just to expand upon that question, could you give an overview of what you alluded to earlier of saying that there are very serious consequences to these technological solutions?
Okay. So more on the consequences of these sorts of responses, yeah? And should we take one additional question? Okay, if we can pass the microphone here, let's just take one more question, and then we'll come to your question in a moment, sir.
I thought this was a very provocative presentation, and I know some of the issues that you're talking about, but certainly not to the degree or the policy insights that you were thinking about with regards to your grappling with this issue. I have been concerned about the health impacts of, for example, Arctic communities, indigenous communities. And there has not been, as far as I know, any epidemiologic undertaking or medical undertaking to measure them, although there are issues related to the loss of villages in areas where there's been rising sea levels, and there have been some interesting hypothetical issues about global climate change and changes in flora and fauna that either may put the community's health at risk. And I am just interested to ask if there has been some consideration of looking at the cross-cutting of the changes that you're talking about, both in terms of carbon capture as well as changes in climate related to adverse impacts on the health of communities most on the edge, if you will, most at risk.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. David, Olufemi, are there any of those questions you'd like to pick up? We'll come to your question in just a moment, sir. We'll respond to these questions first. Thanks.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Should I go first? I'll go first. Okay, so in order here, what happens to the carbon after you inject it underground? It depends in large part on how you're doing it. So there are, in fact, a number of different sort of places you can store this. You can pump it into depleted oil reservoirs, sort of back where it came from. You can inject it into saline aquifers. So these tend to be much deeper than freshwater aquifers, and they're so salty that we're not going to be using them for anything. And they tend to be under dense cap rock that's deep enough that people seem to be confident it will stay down there. The third, and I think most interesting option, is to inject it into basalt. There's a pilot project in Iceland right now. It's about to expand next year, where they've been injecting it directly into basalt. And then they dug up a core after a few years and found that virtually all the carbon dioxide had mineralized. It had turned to rock.
Excuse me, you said basalt or salt?
Basalt, yeah. Turns out it's best to do this with sort of fresh basalt in a geological sense, right? So, only a few million years. So the mid-Atlantic turns out to be perfect for this. But so there's a wide range of sort of fates and consequences there. Thinking about the negative consequences of the technologies, one of the challenges here is that they're different across all the different technologies, and they're often different with different ways you do it.
And at different scales.
And at different scales.
Just to reinforce that point.
Yeah.
Yep.
So to my mind at least, the main concern about direct air capture is that it tends to be very energy intensive. And of course, if you want to maximize your climate impact, you want to do that with low carbon energy. So now you've got a trade-off, right? You build some solar panels to power this direct air capture facility to remove carbon, but now you're not using those solar panels to displace fossil fuels somewhere else in the system. So occasionally people say, oh, well, look, we can just scale up direct air capture really quickly. And then they throw these numbers out there, and you run the math, and they won't tell you this, but they're committing us to using 4 times the entire annual energy consumption of the United States just on direct air capture. Right? So I think they haven't done that math, right? I don't think anyone's actually seriously proposing that, knowing what they're proposing. But it presents a challenge for doing this at a large scale, and especially doing it sooner rather than later. Health impacts, I don't know. Health is certainly not one of my strong suits in climate impacts. I'm working with some people on a paper on intersection between carbon removal and adaptation more generally, ways you can sort of combine the two. So there might be something there. That's a really interesting thought. Maybe Femi can add to any or all of that.
On the last question, again, I'm with David in not focusing on this specifically in what I research, but on nature-based solutions for carbon removal, for example, tending to or planting mangroves. There are nutritional consequences for those sorts of things, those sorts of initiatives, which are at least arguably positive, all the other things being equal. So if you plant mangroves, then you increase the supply of oysters, which increases protein availability and certain vitamin availability. And so arguably there's a positive health, some positive health impacts that we can project from that. But I think with nature-based solutions and any other solution, all the health impacts are going to be secondary to the political consequences. So if people get displaced and moved around, if people get impoverished from something versus if people get economically helped out by something, that's going to confound some of the health things that we can project. So I think it would be great if there would be more research on exactly what your question is about.
Yeah, some folks have said that the ultimate environmental question is what kind of world do you want to create? The conversation that we're having is about what the future looks like. There are lots of different ways to stay beneath 1.5 if that is indeed a target that the international community is committed to. One of those routes would be hand all power over to the corporations and hope they come up with magic technological solutions just over the horizon and make these problems go away. That's the de facto path, right? That basic, to my mind, that's the path that we're on. We're imagining that this thing called the market and corporate power is somehow going to create technological systems that make these problems go away. A very different response is distribute power in a different fashion, focus on co-benefits, and do the low-hanging, simple stuff that we should have been doing as soon as the world knew about climate change as an issue. Right? The fact that things are so hard now is because we've waited so long for that de facto path to somehow play out and solve our problems for us, right? Sorry, I'm getting animated, but this, I mean, it's a conundrum we find ourselves in now, where we're talking about stuff that, by some reasonable measures, is absolutely bonkers, as something that is now required of us because the situation has become so bad. Do you want to add anything to that? I'll pass the microphone. So I'll pass it to the back here first, and then I'll come back to the front. Would you mind passing that microphone along? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to speak as an expert here, but I just recently ran across a little fern called azoa and a whole subculture out there on the web dedicated to growing it. And the stuff is allegedly capable of sucking up 35 gigatons of carbon per hectare per year. So that's a benchmark from one experiment. So azoa has a lot of interesting properties, and maybe you think it was a natural solution. Grows in a little shallow pond, doesn't take up land you'd use for anything else. So you can rack it and stack it. You can do a lot of things with this stuff. So I think part of what you worry about before you jump ahead and worry about all the ethics and the details of how things are gonna go, you need to rank order the various solutions so everybody can look at them and see what their cost is and what their performance is in terms of gigatons per year per hectare before any of this discussion takes place. Because if azoa is anywhere near as good as this initial figure looks, it takes very little area to pull down hundreds of gigatons per year. How many do you need to pull? 500, 600? I don't know. That's just my thought.
Right, if we could pass the microphone forward, so it's a question about how we even start to look at these different things in relation to each other. Thanks. There was another question in front of you once you've spoken. Thank you.
Okay. So I guess I have a prior question about this undertaking, and you've heard it before, but I'd like to hear your answers. I work in renewable energy. I'm also active in the community here on various issues where, as you said, there's low-hanging fruit with evident co-benefits. Things that you just have to be in a coma not to want to do. And yet we're not doing them. And these are mostly for lowering carbon footprint as opposed to a negative carbon footprint. For lowering carbon footprint as opposed to carbon removal, which is a negative carbon footprint. They save money, they have, they're just so obviously the right thing to do, and yet we're getting nowhere. So why are we talking about especially the technological side of carbon removal that doesn't have the co-benefits, that is just a cost? What makes us think that we would undertake that when the things that have such obvious benefits are not being undertaken? My concern is that, as you said, we're just waiting for a silver bullet. Talking about carbon removal gives us an excuse to keep doing the things bad that we're doing today.
Yep. I'm sure there'll be responses to that question. Can we take another comment here, and then I'll turn back to the panel, and then we'll take questions here in a moment. Thanks.
A group of us in Montgomery County, Maryland, were very successful at making our yards carbon sinks. We call this the lowest hanging fruit. And a 2013 American Planning Association report, Green Infrastructure Corridors, absolutely supports how our yards can be, and every farm, if it's an eco-agricultural sustainable farm, can be a carbon sink. And when we started replacing turf grass with conservation vegetation that naturally emerged when we buried our food scraps, rather than put them in the trash where they generate methane gas, we were attacked by our local government because the landscape industry is so politically connected. We were destroyed. And this was in 2006. We could have had all of Montgomery County and ultimately all of Maryland as a model for the whole country to follow. The bird populations quadrupled. The beneficial insect populations quadrupled, which is why the birds were able to multiply and survive. Bushes became trees. And the research shows that one strategically located tree can reduce demand by 50%, in addition to capturing carbon, storing it, feeding our pollinators, preventing stormwater runoff. So that's one reason why there's still so much turf grass around, because of the political considerations. And we couldn't find a lawyer to help. And if you know of a committed attorney, we still need to fight that battle.
Thanks. We have 10 or so minutes left, so let's keep the responses brief, and then we'll have another round of questions. But do you have responses to the questions we've just had?
Yes, but I answered last time, so I'll see it to you guys.
So just on the last two questions, it seemed to me that the third question or comment is kind of what I would say to the second, right? So the reason why we're not mitigating to the extent that we ought to be, why we're not lowering carbon, lowering our emissions to the extent that we should be, is just the exact same political structure that explains why we're not doing carbon removal to the extent that we should be. And so any just carbon removal process is going to be fighting in the identical political fight to this other low-hanging fruit that we ought to do. And so from a political perspective, they're the same issue. And then the only other thing to say is the scientists have said we need both. If both don't happen, we don't prevent the world from getting 1.5 degrees hotter. So even if there's a risk of a kind of moral hazard where talking about carbon removal gives people the wrong idea about whether or not we need to mitigate our emissions as much as we ought to. That's a risk we have been forced into taking by the climate math.
And I think the one other point I would add to the kind of why I talk about the technology for carbon removal now is, it takes time to develop technology. You can't, we won't be able to at the point in time when we need all those direct air capture plants to be online, like we can't just snap our fingers and have them here. There's a amount of time it'll take to get there, and so for that reason as well, it's important to start thinking about and putting resources towards developing the technology today.
Yeah, large-scale direct air capture machines fit much more neatly into the current way of doing things than distributed work by lots of individuals on farmland or in yards, right? And so there's going to be a lot of pushback against lots of individuals trying to take action in this way. But the system, a political, economic, cultural system that we have is much better attuned to large-scale technological response options, right? And so there's a reason beyond just the technical capacity of these different approaches that some are being pushed as the kind of large-scale options that should be on the table. To the question on how to kind of line lots of different things up, we get in our inboxes every couple of days, a new email about a new idea. And what's really needed now, as you're suggesting, is a lot of working out what's real and what's not, and rank ordering things in terms of not just their political and other potential, but in terms of their social desirability. So how do you start wrapping these sustainability criteria around the different response options that are on the table? Did you want to add anything additional as I start to move the mic?
Yeah, real quick. So one thing that I don't think any of us actually said, but we should have, because we spend all our time thinking about it, so it's obvious. None of this is a replacement for cutting emissions. Right? You cannot get to a good place on climate change just through carbon removal. It's got to be a supplement to emissions reductions, not a replacement for it. Two other quick things, echoing Maya's point, if we want to be removing stuff at 1 billion tons a year by 2050, we need to start thinking seriously now about how to do it. On the Isola point, it's not going to be just one thing. We need lots of different things. And when you're ranking them, if you just do it in terms of technical capacity, you're going to exaggerate the potential, because things are going to run into social, political, environmental, ethical obstacles, so they can't scale to the purely technical potential. And so there isn't going to be a CDR silver bullet, a carbon removal silver bullet, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look into all of these things.
So we've got time for one more round of questions, so we can pass the microphone this way. Thanks.
Okay. As an environmental lawyer, I have a hard time understanding why, to your point, that people's hair isn't on fire more about this issue, and why, at least in terms of thinking about the alternatives, there isn't a no action alternative that's out there, which is essentially hundreds of millions of people dying. I don't understand that. And I'd like some answers.
Maya, you got that one?
So this is very interesting and mind-opening in a lot of ways. So the North-South, what do you call it, social justice, big issue. But confounding that issue is the zeroth order energy and quality of life, and 1 billion people with no electricity and potable water. So whatever we do, there are, just look at China as an example. They to probably use a bad shorthand, westernized, or moved their people, industrialized. That's sort of a bad way to say westernized. I get that. Industrialized. And you have Africa, for example. So the largest growth in energy is happening in these same people that are not causing the problem now, just like China didn't cause the problem now, but they sure as hell is causing the problem now because of their move. So it's not a question so much as a comment. Truth be told, I'm an engineer, and I taught nuclear engineering, and I taught society and technology as well, so I get where we are in these mind-bending questions. And I'm always stuck with two things. One is the second law of thermodynamics. So you have CO2 and you want to capture it. I mean, you're you're pushing water uphill. I mean, it's not going to happen without the third leg of your, I think it was you that talked about economic. Just because you can do it doesn't mean it's going to be doable in balance. So those are the comments.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. I think that there were three additional hands. So if we can keep the comments very brief, so we have just time for a quick response.
Yeah. So I actually have a question rather than a comment. You talked. There are obviously a lot of different aspects to any type of solution, and they're all going to will all have to be integrated in some way. So my question is, what sort of specific policy recommendations would you have that could be advocated for at the national level, at the local level, the state level, to actually make any of this happen?
Yeah, good, okay.
I'll partially answer your question. Let me first remark, I'm a retired biologist and physicist from the Department of Energy. I'm not an expert on anything that I say, but fairly knowledgeable. First, on the political side, I think we have to develop an economic reward for carbon capture. And then there'll be lots of people who try diverse solutions. One of them is replenishing the deserts. We have a lot of desert area on Earth. We're at nearly an economic break-even point of being able to produce usable water from seawater purely from solar energy. We're about at turning the edge on this, and when this is achieved, there's a lot of desert which could be used for at least carbon capture, if not large-scale agriculture. Third, we haven't talked about the seas much. And the seas are 70% of the Earth, and they do capture carbon, and we don't know enough about what's going on there in carbon capture.
I'd like to just add a point I brought up with Maya before we assembled that addresses the question of why more hair is not on fire. And I think part of it is that we haven't found a way to advocate effectively and aggressively and mean even. There is a mounting resistance to what is coming to be called scientocracy. And it's obviously a way of getting at what we're after by trivializing it and ridiculing us. And until we find ways of mobilizing, perhaps in the ways that we're suffering, the ways that our opponents are dishing it out, we're not going to actually be able to restructure the economic incentives. There's not been a single mention about carbon tax or cap and trade or any policy strategic ways of going about it. That's where I feel there's a lacuna in what we're doing. And distributive justice is very much at the core of the argument we need to make. I mean, more forcefully, more convincingly somehow. I wish I had some really good suggestions for how we might do that, but I can see it as a principal problem that we face.
Thank you. We have just 4 or 5 minutes for very quick responses. Let me give you that in case you need it. Yep.
So to address a few of the questions, I think the broad overarching thing I would say is that in the US, we have, my perception is that we have a political culture where we imagine calamity as something that happens to other people, right? I'm not that old, but in my lifetime, we've launched 2 full-scale invasions of other countries. And this is a political afterthought, right? I think it's gonna take a major calamity before we understand climate change is something that genuinely affects us. And until that happens, we're gonna face this kind of inertia that we have where people's hairs aren't on fire. Their hairs aren't on fire, though they ought to be, right? So just quickly, 4 specific concrete recommendations that I would make about what policies we all should leave here and support. First, most obviously, fully fund the National Academy of Sciences research and development proposal for carbon removal. They've calculated a number. I think it's a bit over half of what the Department of Energy currently requires for its general operations, but it includes research on ocean alkalinization, so using the ocean as a carbon sink includes a number of things. Fully support a strong reintroduction of the United States into the Paris Agreement and funding the Green Climate Fund, which should provide sustainable development opportunities for developing countries of the global south to develop on a low carbon trajectory and not a high carbon trajectory. Look into a regulatory approach to the rollout of carbon removal, right? So rather than, offering them the opportunity to play games with tax credits, just give them specific targets for how much carbon they must remove. And then Global North, so US, EU, those countries should develop agreements to host certain carbon removal technologies, DACs, and those sorts of things.
Yep.
Real quick.
We're getting the gesture from the door, so last line.
I don't know. Yes, energy. Carbon prices plus some more. Yay, oceans. I agree.
I've got nothing to add. This has been a great treat. Thanks for inviting us to such an interesting forum. Thank you for your questions. If you want more about what we're working on, this is the website for the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, carbonremoval.info. David and I are happy to answer questions from that side. This is Olufemi Taiwo from Georgetown, Breitburg-Smith from Resolve. Thank you all very much.